That summer, right up until the warm weather faded, we developed this odd way of listening to music together in the fields. Walkmans had started appearing at Hailsham since the previous year's sales, and by that summer, there were at least 6 of them in circulation. The craze was for several people to sit on the grass around a single Walkman, passing the headset around. Okay, it sounds a stupid way to listen to music, but it created a really good feeling. You listened for maybe 20 seconds, took off the headset, and passed it on. After a while, provided you kept the same tape going over and over, it was surprising how close it was to having heard it all by yourself. As I said, the craze really took off that summer, and during the lunch breaks, you'd see all these clusters of students lying about the grass around the Walkmans. The guardians weren't too keen, saying we'd spread ear infections, but they let us carry on. I can't remember that last summer without thinking about those afternoons around the Walkmans. Someone would wander up and ask, "What's the sound?" And if they liked the answer, they'd sit down on the grass and wait their turn. There was almost always a good atmosphere around these sessions, and I don't remember anyone being refused a share of the headset. Anyway, that's what I was up to with a few other girls when Ruth came up to ask if we could have a talk. I could tell it was something important, so I left my other friends and the 2 of us walked off, all the way to our dorm hut. When we got to our room, I sat down on Ruth's bed close to the window. The sun had warmed the blanket, and she sat on mine over by the back wall. There was a blue bottle buzzing around, and for a minute we had a laugh playing blue bottle tennis, throwing our hands about to make the demented creature go from one to the other of us. Then it found its way out of the window, and Ruth said, "I want me and Tommy to get back together again. Kathy, will you help?" Then she asked, "What's the matter?" "Nothing," I said. "I was just a bit surprised after what's happened. Of course I'll help." She said, "I haven't told anyone else about wanting to get back with Tommy, not even Hannah. You're the only one I trust." "Well, what do you want me to do?" "Please just talk to him. You've always had this way with him. He'll listen to you. And he'll know you're not bullshitting about me." For a moment we sat there, swinging our feet under the beds. "It's really good you're telling me this," I said eventually. "I probably am the best person, talking to Tommy and all that." "Well," she said, "what I want is for us to make a fresh start. We're about evens now. We've both done daft things, but to hurt each other. But it's enough now. Martha Bloody H, I ask you, maybe he did it just to give me a good laugh. Well, you can tell him he succeeded, and the scores are all even again. It's time we grew up and started afresh. I know you can reason with him, Kathy. You'll deal with it the best possible way. Then, if he's still not prepared to be sensible, I know there's no point carrying on with him." I shrugged. "As you say, Tommy and I, we've always been able to talk." "Yeah, Catherine, he really respects you. I know because he's often talked about it, how you've always got guts and you do what you say you're going to do. He told me once if he was in a corner, he'd rather have you backing him than any of the boys." She did a quick laugh. "Now you've got to admit that's a real compliment. So you see, it's got to be you to our rescue. Tommy and I were made for each other, and he'll listen to you. You'll do it for us, won't you, Kath?" I didn't say anything for a moment, then I asked, "Ruth, are you serious about Tommy? I mean, if you do persuade him and you get back together, you won't hurt him again." Ruth gave an impatient sigh. "Of course I'm serious. We're adults now. Soon we'll be leaving Hailsham. It's not a game anymore." "Okay, I'll talk to him. Like you say, we'll be leaving here soon. We can't afford to waste time." After that, I remember us sitting on those beds talking for some time. Ruth wanted to go over everything again and again, how stupid he was being, why they were really suited to each other, how differently they'd do things next time around, how they'd keep much more private, how they'd have sex in better places at better times. We talked about it all, and she wanted my advice on everything. Then at one point, I was looking out of the window towards the hills in the distance when I was startled to feel Ruth suddenly behind me, squeezing my shoulders. "Kathy, I knew we could depend on you," she said. "Tommy's right. You're just the person to have when you're in a corner." What with one thing and another, I didn't get a chance to talk to Tommy for the next few days. Then one lunchtime, I spotted him on the edge of the south playing field practicing with his football. He'd been having a kickabout earlier with 2 other boys, but now he was alone, juggling the ball about in the air. I went over and sat down on the grass beside him, putting my back against a fence post. This couldn't have been long after that time I'd shown him Patricia's calendar, and he'd marched off, because I remember we weren't sure how we stood with each other. He went on with his ball juggling, scowling with concentration, knee, foot, head, foot, while I sat there picking away at clovers and gazing at the woods in the distance that we'd once been so frightened of. In the end, I decided to break the deadlock and said, "Tommy, let's talk now. There's something I want to talk to you about." As soon as I said this, he let the ball roll away and came to sit down beside me. It was typical of Tommy that once he knew I was willing to talk, there was suddenly no trace left of any sulkiness. Just a kind of grateful eagerness that reminded me of the way we were back in the juniors, when a guardian who'd been telling us off went back to being normal. He was panting a bit, and though I knew this was from the football, it added to his overall impression of eagerness. In other words, before we'd said anything, he'd already got my back up. Then when I said to him, "Tommy, I can tell, you haven't been happy lately," he said, "What do you mean? I'm perfectly happy. I really am." And he did a big beam followed by this hearty laugh. That was what did it. Years later, when I saw a shadow of it every now and then, I'd just smile. But back then, it really used to get to me. If Tommy happened to say to you, "I'm really upset about it," he'd have to put a long, downcast face then and there to back up his words. I don't mean he did this ironically. He actually thought he'd be more convincing. So now, to prove he was happy, here he was, trying to sparkle. As I say, there would come a time when I'd think this was sweet. But that summer, all I could see was it advertised what a child he still was, and how easily you could take advantage of him. I didn't know much then about the world that waited us beyond Hailsham, but I guessed we need all our wits about us, and when Tommy did anything like this, I felt something close to panic. Until that afternoon, I'd always let it go. It always seemed too difficult to explain, but this time I burst out, saying, "Tommy, you look so stupid laughing like that. If you want to pretend you're happy, you don't just do it that way. Just take it from me, you don't do it that way. You definitely don't. Look, you've got to grow up, and you've got to get yourself back on track. Everything's been falling apart for you just lately, and we both know why." Tommy was looking puzzled. When he was sure I was finished, he said, "You're right, things have been falling apart for me. But I don't see what you mean, Kath. What do you mean we both know?" "I don't see how you could know. I haven't told anyone." I said, "Obviously, I don't have all the details, but we all know about you splitting with Ruth." Tommy still looked puzzled. Finally, he did another little laugh, but this time it was a real one. "I see what you mean," he mumbled, then paused a moment to think something over. "To be honest, Kath," he said eventually, "that's not really what's bothering me. It's really something else altogether. I just keep thinking about it all the time, about Miss Lucy." And that was how I came to hear about it, about what happened between Tommy and Miss Lucy at the start of that summer. Later, when I'd had time to think it over, I worked out it must have happened no more than a few days after the morning I'd seen Miss Lucy up in room 22 scrawling over her paperwork. And like I said, I felt like kicking myself I hadn't found out from him earlier. It had been in the afternoon near the dead hour when the lessons were finished, but there was still some time to go till dinner. Tommy had seen Miss Lucy coming out of the main house, her arms loaded with flip charts and files, and because it looked like she'd drop something any moment, he'd run over and offered to help. Well, she gave me a few things to carry and said we were heading back to her study with it all. Even between the two of us, there was too much, and I dropped a couple things along the way. Then, when we were coming up to the orangery, she suddenly stopped, and I thought she'd dropped something else. But she was looking at me like this, straight in the face, all serious. Then she says, "We've got to have a talk, a good talk." I said fine, and so we go into the orangery, into her study, put all the stuff down. And she tells me to sit down, and I end up exactly where I was the last time, that time years ago. And I can tell she's remembering that time as well, because she starts talking about it like it was only the day before. No explanations, nothing. She just starts off saying something like, "Tommy, I made a mistake when I said what I did to you, and I should have put you right about it long before now." Then she's saying I should forget everything she told me before, that she'd done me a big disservice telling me not to worry about being creative, that the other guardians had been right all along, and there was no excuse for my art being so rubbish. Hold on, Tommy. Did she actually say your art was rubbish? Well, if it wasn't rubbish, it was something like that, negligible. That might have been it, or incompetent. She might as well have said rubbish. She said she was sorry she told me what she had the last time, because if she hadn't, I might have sorted it all out by now. Well, what were you saying through all this? I didn't know what to say. In the end, she actually asked. She said, "Tommy, what are you thinking?" So I said I wasn't sure, but that she shouldn't worry either way because I was all right now. And she said, no, I wasn't all right. My art was rubbish, and that was partly her fault for telling me what she had. And I said to her, but what does it matter? I'm all right now. No one laughs at me about that anymore. But she keeps shaking her head saying, it does matter. I shouldn't have said what I did. So it occurs to me, she's talking about later, after we leave here. So I said, but I'll be all right, miss. I'm really fit. I know how to look after myself. When it's time for donations, I'll be able to do it really well. When I said this, she starts shaking her head, shaking it really hard, so I'm worried she's going to get dizzy. Then she says, listen, Tommy, your art, it is important, and not just because it's evidence, but for your own sake. You'll get a lot from it, just for yourself. I said, hold on. What did she mean, evidence? Tommy said, I don't know, but she definitely said that. She said our art was important and not just because it's evidence. God knows what she meant. I did actually ask her when she said that. I said I didn't understand what she was telling me, and was it something to do with Madam and her gallery? She did a big sigh and said, Madam's gallery, yes, that's important. Much more important than I once thought. I see that now. Then she said, look, there are all kinds of things you don't understand, Tommy, and I can't tell you about them. Things about Hailsham, about your place in the wider world, all kinds of things. But perhaps one day you'll try and find out. They won't make it easy for you, but if you want to, really want to, you might find out. She started shaking her head again after that, though not as bad as before, and she said, but why should you be any different? The students who leave here, they never find out much. Why should you be any different? I didn't know what she was talking about, so I just said again, I'll be all right, miss. She was quiet for a time, then she suddenly stood up and kind of bent over me and hugged me. Not in a sexy way, more like they used to do when we were little. I just kept as still as possible. Then she stood back and said again that she was sorry for what she told me before. And that it wasn't too late. I should start straight away making up the lost time. I don't think I said anything, and she looked at me and I thought she'd hug me again. But instead she said, just do it for my sake, Tommy. I told her I'd do my best because by then I just wanted out of there. I was probably bright scarlet with what with her hugging me and everything. I mean, it's not the same, is it, now that we've got bigger? Until this point, I'd been so engrossed in Tommy's story, I'd forgotten my reason for having this talk with him. But this reference to our getting bigger reminded me of my original mission. Look, Tommy, I said, we'll have to talk this over carefully soon. It's really interesting, and I can see how it must have made you miserable. But either way, you're going to have to pull yourself together a bit more. We're going to be leaving here this summer. You've got to get yourself sorted again, and there's one thing you can straighten out right now. Ruth told me she's prepared to call it quits and have you get back with her again. I think that's a good chance for you. Don't mess it up. He was quiet for a few seconds, then said, I don't know, Kath. There are all these other things to think about. Tommy, just listen. You're really lucky. Of all the people here, you've got Ruth fancying you. After we leave, if you're with her, you won't have to worry. She's the best. You'll be fine so long as you're with her. She's saying she wants a fresh start, so don't blow it. I waited, but Tommy gave no response, and again I felt something like panic coming over me. I leaned forward and said, Look, you fool, you're not going to get many more chances. Don't you realize we won't be here together like this much longer? To my surprise, Tommy's response, when it came, was calm and considered, the side of Tommy that was to emerge more and more in the years ahead. I do realize that, Kath. That's exactly why I can't rush back into it with Ruth. We've got to think about the next move really carefully." Then he sighed and looked right at me. "Like you say, Cap, we're going to be leaving here soon. It's not like a game anymore, and we've got to think carefully." I was suddenly lost for what to say and just sat there tugging away at the clovers. I could feel his eyes on me, but I didn't look up. We might have gone on that way for a while longer, except we were interrupted. I think the boys he'd been playing football with earlier came back, or maybe it was some students strolling by who came and sat down with us. Anyway, our little heart-to-heart was at an end, and I came away feeling I hadn't done what I'd set out to do, that I'd somehow let Ruth down. I never got to assess what kind of impact my talk with Tommy had had, because it was the very next day the news broke. It was midway through the morning, and we'd been in yet another culture briefing. These were classes where we had to role-play various people we'd find out there, waiters, policemen, and so on. The sessions always got us excited and worried all at the same time, so we were pretty keyed up. Then, at the end of the lesson, as we were filing out, Charlotte came rushing into the room, and the news about Miss Lucy leaving Hailsham spread through us in an instant. Mr. Chris, who'd been taking the class, and must have had known all along, shuffled off guiltily before we could ask him anything. At first, we weren't sure if Charlotte was just reporting a rumor, but the more she told us, the clearer it became this was for real. Earlier in the morning, one of the other senior classes had gone into room 12 expecting music appreciation with Miss Lucy, but Miss Emily had been there instead, and she told them Miss Lucy couldn't come just at that moment, so she would take the class. For the next 20 minutes or so, everything had gone quite normally. Then suddenly, right in mid-sentence, Miss Emily had broken off from talking about Beethoven and announced that Miss Lucy had left Hailsham and wouldn't be returning. That class had finished several minutes early. Miss Emily had rushed off with a preoccupied frown, and the word had started to go round as soon as the students had come out. I immediately set off to look for Tommy, because I desperately wanted him to hear it first from me. But when I stepped into the courtyard, I saw I was too late. There was Tommy over on the far side, on the edge of a circle of boys, nodding to what was being said. The other boys were animated, maybe excited even, but Tommy's eyes looked empty. That very evening, Tommy and Ruth got back together again, and I remember Ruth reminding me a few days later to thank me for sorting it all out so well. I told her I probably hadn't helped much, but she was having none of that. I was most definitely in her good books, and that was more or less the way things stayed throughout our last days at Hailsham. Sometimes I'll be driving on a long weaving road across marshland, or maybe past rows of furrowed fields, the sky's big and gray and never changing mile after mile, and I find I'm thinking about my essay, the one I was supposed to be writing back then when we were at the cottages. The Guardians had talked to us about our essays on and off throughout that last summer, trying to help each of us choose a topic that would absorb us properly for anything up to 2 years. But somehow, maybe we could see something in the Guardians' manner. No one really believed the essays were that important, and among ourselves we hardly discussed the matter. I remember when I went in to tell Miss Emily my chosen topic was Victorian novels. I hadn't really thought about it much, and I could see she knew it. But she gave me one of her searching stares and said nothing more. Once we got to the cottages, though, the essays took on a new importance. In our first days there, and for some of us a lot longer, it was like we were each clinging to our essay, this last task from Hailsham, like it was a farewell gift from the Guardians. Over time, they would fade from our minds, but for a while those essays helped keep us afloat in our new surroundings. When I think about my essay today, what I do is go over it in some detail. I may think of a completely new approach I could have taken, or about different writers and books. I think of a completely new approach I could have taken, or about different writers and books I could have focused on. I might be having coffee in a service station, staring at the motorway through the big windows, and my essay will pop into my head for no reason. Then I quite enjoy sitting there going through it all again. Just lately, I've even toyed with the idea of going back and working on it once I'm not a carer anymore and I've got the time. But in the end, I suppose I'm not really serious about it. It's just a bit of nostalgia to pass the time. I think about the essay the same way a rounders match at Hailsham I did particularly well in, or else an argument from long ago where I can now think of all the clever things I should have said. It's at that sort of level, daydream stuff. But as I say, that's not how it was when we first got to the cottages. 8 of us who left Hailsham that summer ended up at the cottages. Others went to the White Mansion in the Welsh Hills or to Poplar Farm in Dorset. We didn't know then that all these places had only the most tenuous links with Hailsham. We arrived at the cottages expecting a version of Hailsham for older students, and I suppose that was the way we continued to see them for some time. We certainly didn't think much about our lives beyond the cottages, or about who ran them, or how they fitted into the larger world. None of us thought like that in those days. The cottages were the remains of a farm that had gone out of business years before. There was an old farmhouse, and around it, barns, outhouses, stables, all converted for us to live in. There were other buildings, usually the outlying ones, that were virtually falling down. We couldn't use these for much, but we felt in some vague way responsible, mainly on account of Keffers. He was this grumpy old guy who turned up 2 or 3 times a week in his muddy van to look the place over. He didn't like to talk to us much, and the way he went around sighing and shaking his head disgustedly implied we weren't doing nearly enough to keep the place up. But it was never clear what more he wanted us to do. He'd shown us a list of chores when we first arrived, and the students who were already there, the veterans as Hannah called them, had long since worked out a rotation we kept to conscientiously. There really wasn't much else we could do other than report leaking gutters and mop up after floods. The old farmhouse, the heart of the cottages, had a number of fireplaces where we could burn the split logs stacked in the outer barns. Otherwise, we had to make do with big boxy heaters. The problem with these was they worked on gas canisters, and unless it was really cold, Keffers wouldn't bring many in. We kept asking him to leave a big supply with us, but he'd shake his head gloomily like we were bound to use them up frivolously or else cause an explosion. So I remember a lot of the time outside the summer months being chilly. You went around with 2, even 3 jumpers on, and your jeans felt cold and stiff. We sometimes kept our Wellingtons on the whole day, leaving trails of mud and damp through the rooms. Keffers, observing this, would again shake his head. But when we asked him what else we were supposed to do, the floors being in the state they were, he'd make no reply. I'm making it sound pretty bad, but none of us minded the discomforts. It was all part of the excitement of being at the cottages. If we were honest, though, particularly near the beginning, most of us would have admitted missing the guardians. A few of us, for a time, even tried to think of Keffers as a sort of guardian, but he was having none of it. You went up to greet him when he arrived in his van, and he'd stare at you like you were mad. But this was one thing we've been told over and over, that after Hailsham there'd be no more guardians, so we'd have to look after each other. And by and large, I'd say Hailsham prepared us well on that score. Most of the students I was close to at Hailsham ended up at the cottages that summer. Cynthia, the girl who'd said about me being Ruth's natural successor that time in the art room, I wouldn't have minded her, but she went to Dorset with the rest of the crowd. And Harry, the boy I nearly had sex with, I heard he went to Wales. But all our gang had stayed together, and if we ever missed the others, we could tell ourselves there was nothing stopping us going to visit them. For all our map lessons with Miss Emily, we had no real idea at that point about distances and how easy or hard it was to visit a particular place. We'd talk about getting lifts from the veterans when they were going on their trips, or else how in time we'd learn to drive ourselves and then we'd be able to see them whenever we pleased. Of course, in practice, especially during the first months, we rarely stepped beyond the confines of the cottages. We didn't even walk around the surrounding countryside or wander into the nearby village. I don't think we were afraid exactly. We all knew no one would stop us if we wandered off, provided we were back by the day and the time we entered into Keffer's ledger book. That summer we arrived, we were constantly seeing veterans packing their bags and rucksacks and going off for 2 or 3 days at a time with what seemed to us scary nonchalance. We'd watch them with astonishment, wondering if by the following summer we'd be doing the same. Of course we were, but in those early days it didn't seem possible. You have to remember that until that point we'd never been beyond the grounds of Hailsham, and we were just bewildered. If you told me then that within a year I'd not only develop a habit of taking long solitary walks, but that I'd start learning to drive a car, I'd have thought you were mad. Even Ruth looked daunted that sunny day the minibus dropped us off in front of the farmhouse, circled round the little pond, and disappeared up the slope. We could see hills in the distance that reminded us of the ones in the distance at Hailsham, but they seemed to us oddly crooked, like when you draw a picture of a friend and it's almost right but not quite, and the face on the sheet gives you the creeps. But at least it was the summer, not the way the cottages would get a few months on with all the puddles frozen and the rough ground frosted bone hard. The place looked beautiful and cozy, with overgrown grass everywhere, a novelty to us. We stood together in a huddle, the 8 of us, and watched Kempers go in and out of the farmhouse, expecting him to address us at any moment. But he didn't, and all we could catch was the odd, irritated mutter about the students who already lived there. Once, as he went to get something from his van, he gave us a moody glance, then returned to the farmhouse and closed the door behind him. Before too long, though, the veterans, who had been having a bit of fun watching us being pathetic, we were to do much the same the following summer, came out and took us in hand. In fact, looking back, I see they really went out of their way helping us settle in. Even so, those first weeks were strange, and we were glad we had each other. We'd always move about together and seemed to spend large parts of the day awkwardly standing outside the farmhouse, not knowing what else to do. It's funny now, recalling the way it was at the beginning, because when I think of those 2 years of the cottages, that scared, bewildered start doesn't seem to go with any of the rest of it. If someone mentions the cottages today, I think of easy-going days drifting in and out of each other's rooms, the languid way the afternoon would fold into evening and then night. I think of my pile of old paperbacks, their pages gone wobbly like they once belonged to the sea. I think about how I read them, lying on my front in the grass on warm afternoons, my hair, which I was always growing long then, always falling across my vision. I think about the mornings waking up in my room at the top of the black barn to the voice of students outside in the field, arguing about poetry or philosophy, or the long winters, the breakfasts in steamed-up kitchens, meandering discussions around the table about Kafka or Picasso. There's always stuff like that at breakfast. Never who'd you have sex with the night before, or why Larry and Helen weren't talking to each other anymore. But then again, when I think about it, there's a sense in which that picture of us on the first day, huddled together in front of the farmhouse, isn't so incongruous at all. Because maybe, in a way, we didn't leave it behind nearly as much as we might once have thought. Because somewhere underneath, a part of us stayed like that, fearful of the world around us, and no matter how much we despised ourselves for it, unable quite to let each other go. The veterans, who of course knew nothing about the history of Tommy and Ruth's relationship, treated them as a long-established couple, and this seemed to please Ruth to no end. For the first weeks after we arrived, she made a big deal of it, always putting her arm around Tommy, sometimes snogging him in the corner of her room while other people were still about. Well, this kind of thing might have been fine at Hailsham, but looked immature at the cottages. The veteran couples never did anything showy in public, going about in a sensible sort of way like a mother and father might do in a normal family. There was, incidentally, something I noticed about these veteran couples at the cottages. Something Ruth, for all her close study of them, failed to spot. And this was how so many of their mannerisms were copied from the television. It first came to me watching this couple, Susie and Greg, probably the oldest students at the cottages, and generally thought to be in charge of the place. There was this particular thing Susie did whenever Greg set off on one of his speeches about Proust or whoever. She'd smile at the rest of us, roll her eyes, and mouth very emphatically, but only just audibly, God help us. Television at Hailsham had been pretty restricted, and at the cottages too, though there was nothing to stop us watching all day, no one was very keen on it. But there was an old set in the farmhouse and another in the Black Barn, and I'd watch every now and then. That's how I realized that this God help us stuff came from an American series, one of those with an audience laughing along at everything anyone said or did. There was a character, a large woman who lived next door to the main characters, who did exactly what Susie did. So when her husband went off on a big spiel, the audience would be waiting for her to roll her eyes and say, God help us, so they could burst out with this huge laugh. Once I spotted this, I began to notice all kinds of other things the veteran couples had taken from TV programs. The way they gestured to each other, sat together on sofas, even the way they argued and stormed out of rooms. Anyway, my point is, it wasn't long before Ruth realized the way she'd been carrying on with Tommy was all wrong for the cottages, and she set about changing how they did things in front of people. And there was, in particular, this one gesture Ruth picked up from the veterans. Back at Hailsham, if a couple were parting, even for a few minutes, it had been an excuse for big embraces and snogging. At the cottages, though, when a couple were saying goodbye to each other, there'd be hardly any words, never mind embraces or kisses. Instead, you slapped your partner's arm near the elbow, lightly with the back of your knuckles, the way you might do to attract someone's attention. Usually, the girl did it to the boy, just as they were moving apart. This custom had faded out by the winter, but when we arrived, it was what was going on, and Ruth was soon doing it to Tommy. Mind you, at first, Tommy didn't have a clue what was going on, and would turn abruptly to Ruth and say, "What?" So she'd have to glare furiously at him like they were in a play and he'd forgotten his lines. I suppose she eventually had a word with him, because after a week or so, they were managing to do it right, more or less exactly like the veteran couples. I'd not actually seen the slap on the elbow on television, but I was pretty sure that's where the idea had come from, and just as sure Ruth hadn't realized it. That was why, the afternoon I was reading Daniel Deronda on the grass and Ruth was being irritated, I decided it was time someone pointed it out to her. It was nearly autumn and starting to get chilly. The veterans were spending more time indoors and generally going back to whatever routines they'd had before the summer. But those of us who'd arrived from Hailsham kept sitting outside in the uncut grass, wanting to keep going on for as long as possible, the only routine we'd gotten used to. Even so, by that particular afternoon, there were maybe only 3 or 4 apart from me reading in the field. And since I'd gone out of my way to find a quiet corner to myself, I'm pretty sure what happened between me and Ruth wasn't overheard. I was lying on a piece of old tarp reading when Ruth came wandering over and sat down beside me. She studied the cover of my book and nodded to herself. Then after a minute, just as I knew she would, she began to outline to me the plot. Until that point, I'd been in a perfectly okay mood and had been pleased to see Ruth, but now I was irritated. She'd done this to me a couple times before, and I'd seen her doing it to others. For one thing, there was the manner she put on, a kind of nonchalant but sincere one, as though she expected people to be really grateful for her assistance. Okay, even at the time, I was vaguely aware what was behind it. In those early months, we'd somehow developed this idea that how well you were settling in at the cottages, how well you were coping, was somehow reflected by how many books you read. It sounds odd, but there you are. It was just something that developed between us, the ones who'd arrived from Hailsham. The whole notion was kept deliberately hazy. In fact, it was pretty reminiscent of the way we dealt with sex at Hailsham. You could go around implying you'd read all kinds of things, nodding knowingly when someone mentioned, say, War and Peace, and the understanding was that no one would scrutinize your claim too rationally. You have to remember, since we'd been in each other's constant company since arriving at the cottages, it wasn't possible for any of us to have read War and Peace without the rest noticing. But just like with the sex at Hailsham, there was unspoken agreement to allow for a mysterious dimension where we went off and did all this reading. It was, as I say, a little game we all indulged in to some extent. Even so, it was Ruth who took it further than anyone else. She was the one always pretending to have finished anything anyone happened to be reading, and she was the only one with this notion that the way to demonstrate your superior reading was to go around telling people the plots of novels they were in the middle of. That's why, when she started on Daniel Deronda, even though I'd not been enjoying him much, I closed the book, sat up, and said to her, completely out of the blue, "Ruth, I've been meaning to ask you, why do you always hit Tommy on the arm like that when you're saying goodbye? You know what I mean." Of course, she claimed not to, so I patiently explained what I was talking about. Ruth heard me out, then shrugged. "Oh, I didn't realize I was doing it. I must have just picked it up." A few months before, I might have let it go at that, or probably wouldn't have brought it up in the first place. But that afternoon, I just pressed on, explaining to her how it was something from a television series. "It's not something worth copying," I told her. "It's not what people really do out there in normal life, if that's what you were thinking." Ruth, I could see, was now angry, but unsure how to fight back. She looked away and did another shrug. "So what?" she said. "It's no big deal. A lot of us do it." I said, "What you mean is Chrissy and Rodney do it." As soon as I said this, I realized I'd made a mistake. That until I'd mentioned those two, I'd had Ruth in a corner, but now she was out. It was like when you make a move in chess, and just as you take your finger off the piece, you see the mistake you've made, and there's this panic because you don't yet know the scale of the disaster. Sure enough, I saw a gleam come into Ruth's eyes, and when she spoke again, it was in an entirely new voice. "Oh, so that's it. That's what's upsetting poor little Kathy. Ruth isn't paying enough attention to her. Ruth's got big new friends and baby sister isn't getting played with so often." I said, "Stop all that. Anyway, that's not how it works in real families. You don't know anything about it." "Oh, Kathy, the great expert on real families. So sorry, but that's what this is, isn't it? You've still got this idea, us Hailsham lot, we have to stay together, a tight little bunch, must never make any new friends." I said, "I've never said that. I'm just talking about Chrissy and Rodney. It looks daft the way you copy everything they do." "But I'm right, aren't I?" Ruth went on. "You're upset because I managed to move on, make new friends. Some of the veterans hardly remember your name, and then who can blame them? You never talk to anyone unless they're Hailsham. But you can't expect me to hold your hand the whole time. We've been here nearly 2 months now." I didn't take the bait, but said instead, "Never mind me, never mind Hailsham, but you keep leaving Tommy in the lurch. I've watched you. You've done it a few times just this week. You leave him stranded, looking like a spare part. That's not fair. You and Tommy are supposed to be a couple. That means you look out for him." "Quite right, Kathy. We're a couple, like you say. And if you must intrude, I'll tell you. We've talked about this and we've agreed. If he sometimes doesn't feel like doing things with Chrissy and Rodney, that's his choice. I'm not going to make him do anything he's not ready for. But we've agreed he shouldn't hold me back. Nice of you to be concerned, though." Then she added in a quite different voice, "Come to think of it, I suppose you haven't been that slow making friends with at least some of the veterans." She watched me carefully, then did a laugh as though to say, "We're still friends, aren't we?" But I didn't find anything to laugh about in this last remark of hers. I just picked up my book and walked off without another word.